They say love can blind you, and that wealth can corrupt even the purest hearts. Charlotte Redwood learned this the hard way when she discovered her millionaire husband, Henry Redwood, was leading a double life of lavish parties and secret affairs. Instead of confronting him in rage, she made an extraordinary move. She gave Henry permission to cheat. Yes, you heard that right. She let him indulge in his own moral collapse, never suspecting that behind her calm acceptance lay a stunning plan. In this shocking tale of betrayal, secrets, and revenge, you'll witness how one woman turned heartbreak into an unexpected triumph. Charlotte Redwood stood on the veranda of her opulent estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, staring into the shimmering lights of the city skyline. The estate was a monument to her husband, Henry Redwood's vast empire. Redwood Ventures, an empire he had painstakingly built from the ground up, with some help from his influential family connections. Tall marble columns, sweeping gardens, a private lake, and the staff of 24 all testified to their astronomical wealth. Yet beneath the glossy veneer, Charlotte felt the first stirrings of disquiet. She was carrying their child 3 months pregnant, and something about Henry felt off. Henry Redwood was a tall, charismatic entrepreneur with connections that wove deep into the fabric of New York's business elite. With an Ivy League education from Princeton University and a father, Richard Redwood, who had served 2 terms in the United States Senate, Henry was groomed for greatness from birth. He had met Charlotte at a charity banquet 3 years prior in a swirl of diamonds and tuxedos and well-rehearsed smiles. He was immediately enchanted by her sophistication, her intelligence, and her gentle nature, unlike the socialites he was used to. Within a year, they were married in a wedding that made headlines across major magazines. Real estate, Prince, marries rising. Architect Charlotte Harrington. Charlotte's father, George Harrington, was a private building contractor, a humble man who prided himself on the honesty of his work. He had always worried about his daughter entering Henry's high society world, but Charlotte was convinced that Henry's charm and philanthropic deeds were proof he had a kind, authentic heart. For the first year of marriage, everything seemed perfect. She designed the blueprint for their dream estate. He expanded Redwood Ventures globally. They balanced each other in a beautiful harmony, so Charlotte believed. But soon Henry's world tours for business became more frequent. He was hosting lavish parties on his yacht in Monaco. Strange credit card charges at 5-star hotels in foreign countries appeared. Late-night calls that Henry labeled business emergencies. Charlotte's initial suspicions turned into a gnawing certainty. Henry was cheating. People whispered about him at posh luncheons or in hush-hush tones at private clubs, although never to Charlotte's face, due to her refined reputation. She heard a rumor once from a friend, Elizabeth White, a socially prominent philanthropist, who let slip that Henry had been spotted in Saint-Tropez with a young model draped on his arm. The rumor was quickly dismissed as tabloid gossip, but Charlotte felt the sting of truth. She confronted him one night, trembling with anger, but Henry was cagey dismissive, turning the question back on her. "Why can't you trust me?" He made her feel paranoid, insecure. Over time, Charlotte learned to push her suspicions deep down, plastering a poised smile in public. After all, the Redwood name commanded respect, and if she aired her grievances without proof, she risked social ridicule and possibly jeopardizing her father's contracting business. Several Redwood Ventures affiliates were among his biggest clients. She felt locked in a golden cage. When Charlotte discovered she was pregnant, her emotions were conflicted. On one hand, she was excited to become a mother. On the other, She dreaded bringing a child into a marriage that seemed irretrievably broken. And yet, the Redwood family was overjoyed. Richard Redwood, now retired from politics, gave a grand speech at the Redwood family manor about how the Redwood bloodline would continue. Henry toasted champagne with everyone and placed a protective hand on Charlotte's back, murmuring sweet nothings that almost made her believe him again. But the deception was laid bare when a young woman named Amina Goldar, a social media influencer hailing from Morocco, was caught on camera emerging from Henry's Manhattan penthouse while he was supposedly on a business trip in London. The paparazzi photos circled in hush-hush fashion among the upper crust. They weren't publicly published, thanks to Redwood family power. Yet these images made their way to Charlotte's friend circles. She saw them herself in the back of a black SUV after a friend slid them into her purse. The moment she saw Henry's unmistakable face next to Amina's, everything crystallized. She was in her second trimester, a time that should have been filled with joy and celebration. Instead, she found herself sobbing into the embroidered pillows of their master suite. Eventually, the tears dried, replaced by a startling clarity. She recalled her mother, Fiona Harrington, who had once endured her own marriage to a man who cheated, and how that heartbreak had shaped Fiona's quiet sadness. Charlotte refused to be a silent victim, but she also knew that going head-to-head with Henry Redwood, a man whose wealth and legal connections were virtually limitless, would be akin to stepping into a battlefield armed with a toothpick. That was when a radical idea took root in her mind. What if I let him cheat? It sounded insane at first, but as Charlotte thought about it, she realized there was a twisted brilliance in giving him the rope to hang himself. If Henry believed he had free rein, perhaps he'd reveal his true nature. She consulted discreetly with an old law school friend, David Lawton, a man who now ran a small but potent law firm in upstate New York. David listened in stunned silence as Charlotte outlined her plan. When she finished, he exhaled slowly. "This is unconventional," he said. "But if we handle this right, you'll have the leverage you need, both socially and legally." Charlotte spent several weeks working with David to draft a set of divorce papers so ironclad that Redwood's own phalanx of attorneys would have difficulty untangling them. There was even a hidden clause that no Redwood lawyer would anticipate a small but potent detail that could shift power entirely into Charlotte's hands. She sat with David and a few trusted paralegals, poring over every line, ensuring that if Henry Redwood tried to discard her, he would walk away with minimal control over their child and face significant financial consequences. The next step was to set the stage. "I'll let him cheat freely," she thought, her heart pounding. "He won't know I'm watching, and by the time I drop these papers, it'll be too late." She felt a pang of guilt, wondering if she was stooping too low. But then she recalled the photos of Henry and Amina and the numerous other rumors she had stifled. "No," she told herself, "this is survival." One sunny afternoon, Charlotte approached Henry in his private study, where he was on the phone, presumably with a client from Dubai. She waited patiently until he ended the call. He glanced at her with mild annoyance, but she steadied herself. "I think we need to talk," she said, wrapping her arms around her growing belly protectively. Henry raised an eyebrow, but offered a polite smile. "Of course, my dear. What's on your mind?" There was a slight tremor in her voice, but she spoke with surprising composure. "I realize I can't tie you down to a traditional marriage, if that's not what you want," she said. "I see how stressed you've been traveling, often entertaining important business partners. If you need..." An outlet. I won't stand in your way." He stared at her for a moment, confusion etched into his features. "Are you giving me permission to see other women?" he asked carefully. She shrugged, feigning indifference. "I'm pregnant, Henry. My focus is on the baby right now. I'd rather have honesty than illusions. If you need that sort of freedom, take it. Just don't lie to me about it." There was a silence, thick with tension. Henry's mind was clearly whirring. He seemed caught off guard, torn between relief and suspicion. After all, what wife willingly condones her husband's infidelity? But perhaps a life free of guilt, free from having to hide, was appealing. Slowly he nodded. "If that's what you want," he said softly, "then thank you, Charlotte. I appreciate your understanding." Charlotte forced a small smile, turning to leave. Inwardly, she felt revulsion and heartbreak. But she had to keep her mask on. The plan had begun. In the following weeks, Charlotte played the role of a dutiful wife who no longer asked about Henry's late nights, his questionable text messages, or the hush-hush phone calls he took in their expansive garden. She began to sleep in a separate room, citing that her pregnancy aches kept her tossing and turning all night. Henry didn't protest. In truth, it gave him the perfect cover to come home at odd hours without disturbing her. Sometimes Charlotte heard his footsteps at 3 a.m. Other times the staff quietly informed her that Henry hadn't returned all night. She responded with a serene wave of her hand. "Oh, he's on a business trip," as though the behavior was perfectly normal. Meanwhile, her heart hammered in her chest each time the magnitude of her emotional turmoil pressing down on her. But she always reminded herself, this is for the final act. David Lawton guided her meticulously. "Document what you can," he advised, "but do it discreetly. Keep a private journal with dates, potential whereabouts. If you can gather any proof receipts, phone logs without tipping him off, do it." So Charlotte became a quiet observer. She installed a minimal piece of monitoring software on Henry's personal computer, courtesy of an old colleague from her architectural tech firm. It was nothing invasive, just enough to see if suspicious emails turned up. She also took note of any receipts left behind. She didn't hack his accounts or do anything that might invite legal trouble for herself. She simply paid attention. Sure enough, the evidence piled up. Henry was frequenting a penthouse in Midtown, where he'd host what he called client dinners. A few correspondences with women whose names Charlotte had never heard popped up in his email. He was spending thousands on extravagant gifts at high-end boutiques like Van Cleef and Arpels and Harry Winston. Charlotte quietly snapped photos of every sign of infidelity, storing them in a secret folder. She reminded herself that each piece of evidence was a stepping stone to her ultimate security. Henry's father, Richard Redwood, was not blind to his son's actions. He was a pragmatic, shrewd man who had navigated the murky waters of Washington, D.C. politics. Through the Redwood family's private investigator Garrett Miles, a retired FBI agent, Richard often kept tabs on Henry's activities. One day, Richard visited Charlotte, unannounced, bearing a bouquet of roses for her, and a solemn look in his eyes. She served him tea in the marble-tiled sunroom, trying to hide her growing unease. Richard was never one for idle chatter. After a few pleasantries about her health and the upcoming child, he leaned in. "I know my son is straying," Richard said abruptly, his tone low. Charlotte froze teacup halfway to her lips. She set it down gently. "I see. My family's name has survived generations," he said with quiet fierceness. "I will not allow scandal to ruin it. You are a Redwood now. You must keep appearances. Do you understand?" She clenched her jaw. feeling a flash of anger. He doesn't care about my pain or the baby. He only cares about the Redwood legacy. But she held her composure. Yes, I understand, she responded softly. I will keep up appearances. Richard nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. I will speak to Henry. His gaze flickered to her belly. In the meantime, if you have any concerns about finances, let me know. You and the child should not suffer regardless of Henry's decisions. Charlotte thanked him through gritted teeth. It dawned on her that even though Richard recognized Henry's indiscretions, he had no real intention of stopping his son. The Redwood men covered for each other. She wondered if this pattern extended back through Redwood history, the men indulging themselves, the women forced to maintain the perfect facade. No more, she vowed internally. It ends with me. Around her 7th month of pregnancy, Charlotte discovered an unexpected ally. One of Henry's lovers, a woman named Sylvie Dupont, who hailed from the south of France. Sylvie was a jazz singer who performed regularly at an exclusive club in Manhattan. Charlotte found out about her through a conversation with the Redwood house manager, who mentioned Henry had reserved a private lounge there. Compelled by a strange desire to see the other woman, Charlotte decided to attend a show incognito. She arrived in a simple black dress that didn't overly accentuate her pregnant belly, wearing a broad hat and large sunglasses. She slipped into the dimly lit club, just in time to see Sylvie sing. The woman's voice was mesmerizing, filled with sorrow and longing. Charlotte listened, tears burning her eyes. Is this the woman who has captured Henry's attention? The wave of jealousy and curiosity collided in her heart. After the performance, Charlotte braced herself and approached Sylvie backstage. She introduced herself as a curious listener, not revealing her true identity at first. Sylvie was gracious, offering a shy smile and a polite thank you. But Charlotte's composure faltered when she noticed a discreet diamond bracelet on Sylvie's wrist, the same one Charlotte had seen in a Redwood Ventures invoice last month. It was then that Charlotte lowered her voice. I'm Henry Redwood's wife, she said, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Sylvie's eyes went wide with shock, and she dropped the water bottle she was holding. The plastic clattered to the floor, echoing in the narrow hallway. For a moment, Charlotte thought Sylvie would scream or lash out. But instead, the singer's shoulders sagged in defeat. She gestured for Charlotte to follow her into a small, private dressing room. Once inside, Sylvie sank into a chair, pressed her hands to her temples. You must hate me, Charlotte inhaled shakily. She felt an odd mixture of sadness and empathy. Sylvie didn't exude the cocky aura of a home wrecker. Instead, she seemed like just another woman trapped in Henry's orbit. I don't hate you, Charlotte said quietly. I just needed to see who he was spending time with. Sylvie confessed that Henry had pursued her months ago, showering her with gifts and promises. She had been led to believe his marriage was all but over, that Charlotte was some absentee wife. I'm not proud, Sylvie murmured, tears glistening in her eyes. But I was in a desperate situation financially. My mother needed surgery, and I had no one else to turn to. Henry made it easy. Hearing this, Charlotte realized that Henry's power extended even to the hearts of those struggling for survival. He exploited vulnerability. She wasn't alone in her victimhood. With a trembling hand, Charlotte took Sylvie's. I'm sorry, she said. I wish things were different. Before leaving, Charlotte left her personal cell number with Sylvie. If you ever need to talk, she whispered, meaning it. As she walked out into the chilly Manhattan night, her heart felt unbearably heavy. She realized Henry wasn't just cheating out of lust. he also manipulated people. The moral lines became blurrier, yet Charlotte's resolve to see her plan through only hardened. At 8 months pregnant, Charlotte was physically exhausted and emotionally drained. She had illusions of a loving husband who would rub her feet, indulge her midnight cravings, and make sure she felt cherished. Instead, she was playing puppet master to a man who was gallivanting around the city with multiple women. Her father, George Harrington, noticed her stress, but she couldn't reveal the full extent of her scheme. She simply told him she was dealing with Henry's business woes. Nevertheless, some days proved too overwhelming. She almost called off her plan multiple times, nearly succumbing to a meltdown. But David Lawton continued to reassure her, reminding her of the bulletproof divorce papers they had meticulously crafted. The hidden clause was crucial, a stipulation that if Henry was found to have engaged in extramarital affairs during her pregnancy, Charlotte would receive a controlling interest in Redwood Ventures shares set aside in a trust for the child. Henry had once made an offhand promise that our child will inherit Redwood Ventures one day. Charlotte had turned that notion into a contract clause that Redwood's lawyers would likely overlook in the standard prenuptial agreement's update. David's skill lay in merging older Redwood trust documents with new language that Henry had casually initialed months prior. If he tried to fight her on it, the Redwood family risked a massive scandal, since the entire city would learn of the infidelity. That was the nuclear button. One late afternoon, Henry strolled into the house, reeking of expensive cologne and the faint scent of perfume that was not Charlotte's. She took a steadying breath and approached him with a gentlesome smile. "Henry, the baby will be here soon. The Redwood lawyers are updating our estate documents, something about inheriting the Redwood fortune. They mentioned you need to sign a few papers. It's mostly standard procedure to align with Redwood family protocols." She tried to keep the tremor out of her voice. He waved his hand dismissively. Sure, just put it on my desk." "I'll sign." She brought the folder the next day. The Redwoods' legal counsel typically would review everything, but Henry's father was out of town, and Redwood Ventures' top attorney was currently busy negotiating a big merger overseas. Henry, too, preoccupied with calls, simply flipped through pages, asked if Charlotte was sure everything was standard, and scrawled his signature in the designated spots. Charlotte stood there, nails digging into her palms, trying to hide the tremor in her breathing. It's done, she thought. The day Charlotte went into labor was both terrifying and oddly hopeful. She was rushed to the hospital in the Redwood family's personal limousine. Henry was at his midtown penthouse, but arrived at the hospital shortly after looking unexpectedly anxious. Through the painful contractions, Charlotte noted the worry etched on his face. A fleeting thought. Does he actually care? But the question vanished amidst the agony of labor. After 10 excruciating hours, Charlotte gave birth to a baby girl they named Eleanor. The moment Charlotte heard Eleanor's first cry, her heart flooded with an indescribable mixture of love, relief, and heartbreak for what might have been if Henry had truly been a devoted husband. Henry held the baby eyes brimming with tears. He looked at Charlotte, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw genuine love in his gaze. He bent down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, voice cracking. The swirl of emotions in Charlotte's chest threatened to overwhelm her. She allowed herself a few minutes of believing this was a new beginning. Maybe Henry would turn over a new leaf and be the father Eleanor deserved. Over the next week, Henry played the role of a doting father, bringing Charlotte gourmet meals, helping the nurses fussing over Eleanor's every whimper. For a brief time, Charlotte basked in the illusion. But illusions have a way of shattering. On the night Charlotte returned home, as she was tending to Eleanor, she heard Henry speaking on the phone in the adjacent study. His tone was low, urgent. "Darling, yes, I know. Look, it was just the baby. You know I had to be there. We'll go to Milan next week, don't worry. I'll handle Charlotte." Charlotte's hand froze mid-air, pressing a soft towel to Eleanor's face. He's still planning a trip with some other woman. All at once, the ephemeral hope she'd allowed herself to feel disintegrated. She swallowed the lump in her throat and kissed the top of her newborn's head, tears gliding down her cheeks. "I've done all I can. Now I protect my child and me." 2 days later, Henry strolled into the mansion's sprawling living room. He was on another call, presumably finalizing travel arrangements. Charlotte sat on the plush sofa, arms folded, her expression resolute. She had a manila envelope in her lap. When Henry ended his call, she cleared her throat. "I have something for you," she said, offering him the envelope. Inside at the top were the divorce papers, 10 neatly printed pages with David Lawton's firm's logo. Henry's face blanched. "What is this?" he demanded, rifling through the sheets. "Divorce," Charlotte said calmly, though her heart hammered in her chest. "I'm done pretending this is a marriage. You can keep your affairs. I won't stand in your way. I only want what's fair for me and our daughter." He shot her a stunned look. "You agreed." "I agreed not to fight you about your lifestyle," Charlotte interjected, voice icy. "But I never said I'd remain your wife under these circumstances. Now that Eleanor is here, I refuse to live under your shadow." His lips curled in disdain. "Fine," he said, throwing the papers onto the marble coffee table. "If you want a divorce, you'll leave with the clothes on your back. Our prenup is ironclad." Charlotte smirked, her eyes flinty. "You might want to actually read the terms this time." He snatched up the documents again, flipping through them with increasing panic. Then he saw the hidden clause, the one referencing the Redwood Trust's inheritance and the controlling interest in Redwood Ventures if an extramarital affair was documented. The details were spelled out with clarity. If Henry was found at fault for infidelity during her pregnancy or the child's first year, Charlotte could claim a sizable share of Redwood Ventures' assets on behalf of Eleanor, effectively giving Charlotte controlling power over Henry's stake should she choose to exercise it. She had it in writing that Henry had acknowledged fatherhood and pledged unwavering fidelity during pregnancy and the child's infancy. His signature was right there with the Redwood notary's stamp. Henry's cheeks flushed scarlet. "You! How dare you trap me like this?" Charlotte rose, crossing her arms. "You gave me no choice. I only secured our future. A man who cheats on his pregnant wife is someone who can't be trusted. I had to protect myself and our daughter." He looked ready to erupt. "I'll call my lawyers. We'll fight this in court." She shrugged. "Go ahead. If we go to court, everything will come out the mistress insent. Tropers the nights at your penthouse, the receipts, the phone records, the gifts. And trust me, I have proof. Do you really want the Redwood name dragged through tabloids? Your father might have political connections, but even he can't bury a scandal of this magnitude." Henry's face contorted with fury, then twisted with defeat. He realized the precarious position. Redwood Ventures had several pending deals with major international partners. A scandal could cause stock prices to plummet, tarnish the Redwood brand, and incite a media circus. "You..." "Cunning," he began, then stopped himself, inhaling raggedly. Charlotte felt both triumph and sorrow in that moment. "I never wanted this," she thought bitterly, "but you forced my hand." She steeled herself. "We can settle this quietly," she offered, her voice steady. Sign the divorce. I'll take custody of Eleanor. You can have visitation, but Redwood Ventures remains partially under my control for our daughter's sake until she's of age. You can avoid a public battle, and we can both move on. Henry sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. She watched him, her heart pounding. For all his cruelty, for all the heartbreak, seeing him so defeated, tugged at a shred of her humanity. But then she remembered his phone call about Milan, the hush-hush dinners, the tears she'd shed alone in bed, and she felt only resolve. The Redwood mansion, once a symbol of untouchable power and legacy, now stood like a fortress under siege. The walls had witnessed decades of whispered deals, polished diplomacy, and silent betrayals, but now they echoed with the tension of a family imploding from within. It didn't take long for news of the divorce settlement to reach Richard Redwood. Despite all efforts to keep the matter quiet, someone from the legal team had leaked just enough to stir whispers within the business elite. That was all it took. Within days, Richard had a printed copy of the revised estate and trust documents in hand, and fury coursing through his veins. One morning, without warning, he arrived at Charlotte's townhouse. He didn't knock politely. He pounded on the door with the authority of a man who had once commanded votes in the U.S. Senate. Charlotte opened the door, Eleanor balanced on her hip. "We need to talk," Richard barked. She looked him over coolly, then stepped aside. "Keep your voice down. Your granddaughter is sleeping." He stepped into the living room like a storm in human form. His gaze swept across the minimal, tasteful decor with a kind of disdain. This wasn't the opulence of the Redwood estate, but it had warmth, something money couldn't buy. "I want answers," Richard said, turning to face her. "You slipped a clause into the Redwood Trust. You now control part of the company. That was never agreed upon." Charlotte met his stare without flinching. "It was agreed upon the moment your son signed those documents. He had every opportunity to read them. He didn't. That's not my fault." His jaw tightened. "You took advantage." "No," she said calmly. "I protected my daughter. Something your son refused to do when he was flying to Milan with another woman during my pregnancy." Richard's lips pressed into a hard, bloodless line. "You're threatening Redwood Ventures. I'm protecting my family," she corrected. "And if this goes to court, I have more than enough evidence to back every claim." He threw the papers onto her coffee table. "This is extortion." "No," she replied, voice even, eyes steady. "This is justice." For a moment they stood in silence. Then Richard, the ever-calculated patriarch, recalibrated. His voice lowered. "What do you want, Charlotte? Money? A quiet settlement? We can arrange that." Charlotte let out a dry laugh. "I already have a settlement. I want stability for Eleanor. I want Redwood Ventures to fund the community projects Henry promised. And I want you to stop treating me like I'm disposable." He looked at her for a long time. Something shifted in his eyes, not acceptance, but acknowledgement. He had underestimated her. Gravely. "I see now why Henry fell for you," he said at last. "You're smarter than you look." "I'm smarter than you think," she replied sharply. "That's your real mistake." He stood there for a moment longer, seething behind a brittle veneer of diplomacy. Then he gave a terse nod. "We'll be in touch," he said, turning towards the door. Charlotte followed him out and watched as he disappeared into the waiting town car, the door slamming shut with finality. Later that evening, Henry called. His voice was flat. "My father's furious." I gathered Charlotte replied, rocking Eleanor gently in her arms. "He thinks you're trying to destroy the company." I'm trying to ensure it doesn't destroy our daughter's future." There was a pause. "I'm sorry," Henry said again, quieter this time. "I didn't read the documents. I should have." "But I was distracted," she finished for him. "That's the story of our marriage." Silence. Charlotte shifted Eleanor to her other shoulder, kissed her tiny forehead. "The damage is done, Henry. I'm not trying to punish you. But I won't let Eleanor be raised by men who think women are pawns to move around a board." "You have my word," he said finally. "I won't challenge the clause." "You better not," she said, voice steel. "Because this time I won't just fight, I'll win." When she ended the call, Charlotte stared out the window, the sky awash in soft gold as the sun began to set. The Redwood Empire was still standing, but the foundation had cracked, and she had done it without raising her voice, without threats, just with the truth. And truth she'd learned was the most devastating weapon of all. The weeks after the settlement were calm on the surface, but emotionally volatile beneath. Charlotte moved through each day with a practiced grace, but inside she remained on high alert. The Redwood family might have signed the documents, but their history of control and silent retaliation lingered in her mind like smoke that refused to clear. She was careful. She double-checked every transaction secured Eleanor's documents in a private safety deposit box, and ensured all custody schedules were filed through official channels. No verbal agreements, no casual promises. Everything documented. She had learned the hard way that trust, when broken, doesn't easily rebuild. Then one morning, her phone rang. It was a name she hadn't seen in weeks, Sylvie DuPont. The jazz singer's voice was hushed, tinged with hesitation. "Charlotte, I heard. About the settlement. About the trust clause." Charlotte tightened her grip on the phone. "You heard correctly." There was a pause. Then Sylvie's voice softened. "I want to help if you still need me. I have messages, recordings. I don't want anything from you. I just want to be part of the truth." Charlotte sat down on the armrest of her couch, surprised by the sincerity. "Sylvie, you don't owe me anything." "But I owe myself the closure," Sylvie replied gently. "And I owe it to every woman who's ever been manipulated by someone like Henry. If there's ever a trial, or if things flare up again, I'll testify." For a moment, Charlotte said nothing. She felt a deep, unexpected swell of gratitude. Not pity, just mutual recognition. "Thank you," she said at last. "I hope we don't need it. But knowing you're willing means more than you know." Sylvie exhaled through the line. "Take care of that little girl." Charlotte nodded. "I will." That conversation stayed with her. Not because of what Sylvie offered, but because it reminded her of something she hadn't felt in a long time: solidarity. Then, just as the rhythm of her new life began to settle, another unexpected moment arrived. It was a rainy Wednesday. Charlotte was reviewing a proposal for a small public library renovation project when the intercom at her townhouse buzzed. She wasn't expecting anyone. "Who is it?" she asked, pressing the speaker. A familiar voice crackled through. "It's me. Henry." Her heart skipped, then hardened. "What do you want? 5 minutes?" "Please." Against her better judgment, but fueled by curiosity, Charlotte allowed him in. When he appeared in her foyer, soaked from the rain, despite the umbrella, she almost didn't recognize him. Not because of his appearance, but because of the absence of arrogance. His shoulders drooped. His eyes were tired. He stepped inside hesitantly, glancing around at the modest but warm home she'd created. Eleanor was napping in her nursery. "Say what you came to say," Charlotte said. Henry took a breath. "I've been thinking about everything, about who I was and who I still might be." She crossed her arms. "Go on." "I've stepped back from Redwood Ventures," he said quietly. "My father's furious, but I needed space. I've enrolled in a non-profit leadership course. I want to try something different. I want to help not just build more wealth." Charlotte's expression didn't change, but inside a flicker of disbelief registered. Henry, stepping away from Redwood. It sounded impossible. "You expect applause?" she asked, more to test him than mock him. "No," he said. "I expect you to doubt me. But I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness. I'm here to ask if I can still be part of Eleanor's life." His voice cracked. "I don't want to be a footnote in her childhood." Charlotte studied him. His sincerity seemed real, but how long would it last? "That depends on you," she said. "If you want visitation, stick to the schedule. If you show up late, if you miss dates, if you bring us chaos, the agreement won't changes." He nodded quickly. "I understand. And don't you dare bring your distractions, your other lives into hers." "I won't," he said. I want to be better." There it was again, that flicker of remorse. Charlotte wasn't ready to forgive, but she could allow space for growth. Not for him. For Eleanor. "Then earn it," she said. They stood in silence for a moment. "Can I see her?" he asked, voice soft. Charlotte hesitated. Then she nodded. She led him down the hall to the nursery, where Eleanor lay in her crib, a soft mobile spinning above her. Henry stepped inside slowly, as if entering a sacred space. He gazed down at his daughter, awestruck. His hand hovered over the crib's edge, but didn't touch. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "So much like you." Charlotte said nothing. She let the moment speak. As he looked down, a tear slipped from his eye. Charlotte watched, unsure if it was guilt, regret, or something else. Maybe all of it. "I'll let myself out," he said finally. "Thank you for letting me see her." She followed him to the door, but didn't say goodbye. She just nodded. After he left, Charlotte returned to Eleanor's crib, staring at her sleeping daughter. The world was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Charlotte had changed. She was no longer waiting to be rescued, redeemed, or repaired by someone else's actions. She was her own compass now, and she would protect Eleanor with the same ferocity that had gotten her through every betrayal. In this life there were no more surprises that could unmake her, because now she was unshakable. The formalities were done, but the emotional residue lingered like a storm that had passed without fully clearing the skies. Charlotte left the Redwood Ventures legal building with Eleanor cradled in her arms, and the finalized divorce settlement tucked in her leather folder, a symbol of both closure and survival. Outside, the world continued like nothing had changed. But for Charlotte, everything had. That evening, she sat alone in her townhouse's living room, watching Eleanor sleep in her bassinet. The baby's chest rose and fell with soft, rhythmic breaths, oblivious to the empire her mother had just wrestled part of, away from deceit and control. Charlotte ran her fingers over the edge of the signed agreement, letting herself breathe deeply for the first time in months. It was more than a legal document. It was her emancipation. The trust clause had held. Despite their resistance, Redwood Ventures' attorneys had no choice but to accept the consequences. With Henry's signature and the timeline of his documented affairs, Charlotte had secured partial control over a Redwood trust set aside for their daughter. In practical terms, it meant she held a voice in key decisions. In symbolic terms, it meant she had stood toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful families in the Northeast and walked away with her dignity intact. Henry hadn't spoken much after the signing. His silence was not of defiance, but of quiet resignation. Whatever power he had once wielded over Charlotte had been dismantled piece by piece by her quiet persistence. Later that week, Henry sent a message through his assistant, a request to meet Eleanor outside the scheduled visitation. Charlotte declined, not out of spite, but because she needed space. She had given him enough chances. He would see their daughter when agreed upon, no more, no less. Richard Redwood, ever the strategist, also kept his distance. His fury had cooled into reluctant acceptance. The last email he sent Charlotte was unusually brief. "You handled yourself with skill. The board respects results. We'll move forward." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And that was more than she ever expected. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte's phone rang frequently, not from social calls, but from professionals now intrigued by her resilience. A former Harvard classmate offered to partner with her on a municipal housing project. An architectural journal reached out for a profile interview. Even a real estate investor she'd once met at a gala inquired about funding her firm's next expansion. For the first time in years, Charlotte was no longer seen as Henry Redwood's wife. She was Charlotte Harrington, an architect, a mother and a woman who'd rewritten the rules of survival. She stood by the window one morning, Eleanor gurgling in a playpen nearby, and watched the sun rise over the rooftops of Greenwich. It cast a warm golden hue across the floorboards, lighting the room with quiet promise. The settlement had ended her marriage. But it had also given birth to something else entirely. A new beginning. The news of the divorce broke quietly, released through a meticulously worded statement from the Redwood family's PR team. After much reflection, Charlotte and Henry Redwood have mutually decided to part ways due to irreconcilable differences. Their focus remains on co-parenting their daughter Eleanor with love and respect. The public bought it. Investors breathed a sigh of relief, grateful that Redwood Ventures hadn't spiraled into scandal. Behind the sanitized language, however, was a woman rebuilding her life from the ashes of deception and a man reckoning with the legacy of his choices. Charlotte didn't seek the spotlight. She let the media frenzy fade while channeling her energy into raising Eleanor. Her days were now filled with lullabies and architectural sketches, diaper changes and client consultations. The whirlwind of betrayal had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. She was no longer a pawn in someone else's empire. She was the architect of her own. With the divorce settlement finalized and the trust clause intact, Charlotte launched her own firm, Harrington Architecture. It was a tribute to her father's integrity and her own rebirth. She didn't need the Redwood name to succeed her talent, and resilience would carry her forward. Her father George stood proudly by her side, helping with everything from client outreach to babysitting Eleanor. "You've got this kiddo," he often said, handing her blueprints while rocking his granddaughter. His steady presence reminded her that not all men abandoned their families. Some stood tall, no matter the storm. Henry, for his part, honored the visitation terms. His appearances were predictable but subdued. He brought plush toys and rare baby books, always dressed impeccably and trying in his awkward way to make up for what he'd lost. Charlotte remained cordial, though never unguarded. Her boundaries were firm. Eleanor came first, always. A few months after the dust settled, Henry surprised her. He arrived unannounced at the Harrington architecture office one rainy afternoon, looking uncharacteristically unsure. Charlotte, startled but composed, led him to the conference room. "I needed to see you," he said, voice quieter than she remembered. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry." She sat across from him, expression unreadable. "I was blind," he continued. "I didn't realize what I had until I destroyed it. You were always more than I deserved." Charlotte didn't rush to respond. She studied his face, the once smug entitlement now replaced with traces of humility. For a moment, she saw not the man who betrayed her, but a man finally confronting his own reflection. "I appreciate you saying that," she replied, voice even. "But the damage is done." Henry nodded slowly. "I'm stepping back from Redwood Ventures for a while. My father thinks I'm being foolish, but I need to figure out who I am outside of the money, the pressure, the expectations." There was a pause. "I've been thinking about doing more philanthropic work, something with substance." A flicker of emotion crossed Charlotte's face. "I hope you do," she said. "For Eleanor's sake, if nothing else." They sat in silence, broken only by the faint patter of rain against the windows. When Henry finally stood, he looked down at her one last time. "Are you happy?" It wasn't a question she'd considered in full. She thought of Eleanor's laugh, the peaceful mornings, her firm slowly taking shape. She smiled, small, real. "I'm getting there." And with that, he left. No grand gestures, no pleas for forgiveness, just the quiet, reluctant departure of a man who had finally accepted the consequences of his actions. Over the next year, Charlotte flourished. Harrington architecture earned praise for its innovative yet community-focused designs. Her most celebrated project was a state-of-the-art community center in Brooklyn, funded ironically by Redwood Ventures' philanthropic division at Henry's own urging. Charlotte had accepted the backing not as a favor, but as a strategic win for the people who needed it most. Meanwhile, Sylvie DuPont, the jazz singer, once entangled in Henry's double life, reached out occasionally. She'd secured a record deal in Europe and had moved on with her life. Her voice, once tinged with guilt, now held gratitude. "Thank you for not making me another casualty," she once said. Charlotte never blamed Sylvie. They had both been manipulated. Both had found the strength to walk away. Even Richard Redwood eventually offered a sliver of reluctant respect. During a charity gala, after a tense speech and stiffer-than-usual champagne, he approached her. "You proved me wrong," he muttered under his breath. "That doesn't happen often." Charlotte simply raised her glass. "Let's hope it becomes a habit." She knew the Redwood name still held power, but she also knew now that her power didn't come from proximity to it. It came from surviving it. And each morning as sunlight streamed through the windows of her new home and Eleanor's laughter filled the air, Charlotte felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. She had built more than a firm. She had built a life brick by brick, truth by truth. And this time, no one could take it from her. Months turned into a year, and Charlotte thrived. Harrington architecture garnered praise, especially after she designed a cutting-edge community center in a lower-income neighborhood in Brooklyn with generous backing from Redwood Ventures' philanthropic wing. It was an odd twist. Redwood Ventures supported her philanthropic efforts, partly to maintain a good public image, but also because Henry, in a gesture of remorse, had urged the board to back the project. Charlotte accepted not for Redwood's sake, but for the people who would benefit from the new center. Eleanor grew into a happy, curious toddler, beloved by both her mother and father. Henry kept to his visitation schedule, never missing a single visit. Sometimes he asked Charlotte for parenting tips, though it was always tinted with awkwardness. She saw glimpses of a better man in him now and then, but the scars of betrayal remained. They kept things amicable for Eleanor's well-being. Sylvie Dupont reached out occasionally, updating Charlotte about her blossoming music career. She had landed a record deal in Europe, far from the Redwood orbit. She thanked Charlotte for not turning her life upside down, too. Charlotte never blamed Sylvie. They were both used and cast aside in different ways by the same wealthy, powerful man. As for Richard Redwood, he begrudgingly accepted Charlotte's position within Redwood Ventures through the trust. Over time, she developed a cordial, if distant, relationship with him, typically revolving around the business's philanthropic involvements. He once expressed reluctant admiration for her tenacity, though it came out in a gruff aside during a formal dinner. "You proved me wrong, Charlotte." "That doesn't happen often," he said, raising his glass in a half-toast. She accepted the gesture with polite detachment. In the end, Charlotte Redwood, now officially Charlotte Harrington, again found her own footing in a world that had tried to box her in as just another trophy wife. She discovered that her worth wasn't defined by Henry Redwood's name or fortune. Instead, she forged her path, ensuring her daughter's future was secure and blazing a trail for herself in architecture. The divorce papers with that cunningly hidden clause had been her salvation, a lifeline that pulled her out of a gilded prison and into the light of independence. The Redwood Empire continued, albeit changed. Henry Redwood had learned a painful lesson, one that cost him his marriage and forced him to reckon with his own character. Whether he would truly become a better man remained uncertain, but at least he was trying one visit with Eleanor at a time. And Charlotte. She rose each morning to the sound of her daughter's laughter, ready to draft new blueprints, not just for buildings, but for a life built on self-respect, resilience, and the unwavering belief that love must always be rooted in truth. Her story was a testament that sometimes letting someone betray you openly can be the key to breaking free, especially when you hold the trump card that changes everything. Sometimes life's greatest victories emerge from our darkest trials. Charlotte learned this when she boldly allowed Henry to betray her in the open, all while meticulously preparing her escape route. Though their marriage crumbled, she forged a new path, one free from deception and secured by a clause that gave her real power. In the end, she showed us that a painful betrayal doesn't have to define your future. It can become the catalyst for unimaginable strength and rebirth. If you found this story moving, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends who need a lesson in resilience, and subscribe to our channel for more riveting tales of love, loss, and triumph. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that reveal the hidden depths of the human spirit. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the boldest moves come from the quietest hearts.